Bashir and Plain Simple Garak are discussing cardigan literature on the way to one of their regular lunch dates. I say discussing, but it's more that Bashir is saying he didn't care for a book recommendation, and Plain Simple Garak is explaining why he's wrong. It's something to do while they queue to use the replimat, though something else to do is show signs of experiencing significant pain. Plain Simple Garak tries to wave away concern, something made less convincing by another bout during him saying it's fine. Bashir tries to take him to the infirmary and is met with a resounding sod off. Whatever it is, Plain Simple Garak has no wish to discuss it, and a little rudeness before he leaves ensures the conversation stays ended. Bashir has more luck treating one of Dax's plants at least. Keiko's our resident botanist, but she's not here at the moment because we need a reason for Dax and Bashir to talk. The conversation turns to Plain Simple Garak, of course, and how he looked distinctly unwell earlier. Bashir's disappointed that his forbidden squeeze wouldn't share what was wrong, and it's bothering him more than he wants to admit. It must be a little galling, then, to see Plain Simple Garak and Quark engaged in some scheming. Quark's being asked to procure something not mentioned, and Plain Simple Garak is very insistent that it be soon before departing. Bashir tries to fish for data from Quark, saying he accidentally overheard them, and is told it's a tailoring tool. Whatever it really was, Quark has no intention of telling him. Perhaps Bashir's decided to take matters into his own hands. He's asked O'Brien to visit the infirmary, his intentions being to see if the Cardigans left any medical data that might be recoverable after they purged the system. Accessing somebody's medical data without their consent is a massive ethical breach, of course, but let's ignore that for now. The morals are academic anyway, as O'Brien tells him it'd take weeks to scan through and see what can be undeleted. The idea is pushed out of his mind by an urgent call from Quark. Plain Simple Garak is trying a different solution to whatever's causing him discomfort, and one that isn't working. He apologizes to Bashir for being rude earlier, then starts being rude again when Bashir tries to get him to go to the infirmary. He stops when the pain returns, but only because it's difficult to be rude when you've collapsed. At least he can't argue against getting checked over now, and we're teleported away. Bashir's had a look inside Plain Simple Garak and discovered that he has some not insignificant brainial implants. He doesn't recognize them and asks Odo, reasoning that he's the most likely to know what they are after his working relationship with the Cardigans. He hasn't the foggiest, but after being told by Bashir that it connects to the entire nervous system, suggests it might be some form of punishment device. That would fit his understanding of Cardigan justice. Bashir's not convinced. This has been in him for years based on what he's seen, so if they were pissed at him, why has it only started hurting him now? They need more information, which is why Bashir mentions Quark being involved somehow. Odo can help there. He's got a permanent wiretap on all of Quark's calls, the legal status of this being something he shrugs off. He invites Bashir to visit his office in the middle of the night, the time when Quark does most of his shady shit, so they can watch some TV. It's a very informative program indeed. His contact is happy to catch up with Quark, and even happier to have a chance at making some cash on the side. Quark's after a piece of biotech and a manual for using it, but doesn't know what it's for. In his business, it doesn't pay to ask too many questions. All he has is a code and he sends it over. The contact enters it and immediately shits a brick when an alarm goes off. Whatever it is, it's very, very, very secret, which is to be expected when it's connected with the Obsidian Order, and Quark quickly hangs up at the news. Bashir doesn't recognize the name, so Odo does the honors. The Obsidian Order are essentially a Cardigan intelligence service, but to call them such is to woefully understate their skills, power, and reach. It takes a very special kind of bastard to be a spy in a society so riddled with scheme and counter-scheme. It all raises a lot of questions, chief among them why Plain Simple Garak would want another one if it's a punishment device. Bashir's out of luck for answers if he'd planned on asking, as upon returning to the infirmary, we discover that his patient has buggered off. Bashir finds him back in his quarters after using an emergency code to open the door. He's injecting anesthetic, and rather a lot of it, all to no effect. Bashir wants to know what the bloody hell's going on, and lays out what he knows to see what it'll shake loose. Learning that Quark has failed and Bashir already knows about the brainial implant seems to free Plain Simple Garak's tongue, and he sets Bashir straight about it being a punishment gizmo. It's intended to be the opposite, in fact, a device to resist torture by dumping endorphins into the body, and he says it was implanted by the head of the Obsidian Order himself, a certain Enabran Tain. All well and good under normal usage conditions, but plain simple Garak's been running it for 2 years. Cardigans were built for warmer, darker environments than how the station is currently run, and living with the constant disgust of nearly everybody else on the station isn't a barrel of laughs either. A few minutes a day became a bit more, became a lot more, became just not turning it off, all of which has resulted in the thing malfunctioning. As an anti-torture device, it's obviously not something that can be easily removed. That would defeat the point. And plain simple Garak's body has now adjusted to the new normal, meaning shutting it off would be a bit of a pisser too. Bashir tries to provoke him into seeking help by framing it as defying the people who exiled him, which takes a curious turn when plain simple Garak says this is for all the bad shit what he done. He even gives an example. He says he was a gull during the occupation and tracking down some escaped Bajorans. He says his aide, a lad called Elim, chased them to a Cardigan shuttle but wasn't allowed to search it. So plain simple Garak just blew it up, killing the escapees, Elim, and nearly 100 Cardigans. All of which he'd have probably gotten away with or even been commended for, had one of the passengers not been related to a high-ranking military git. The result was a swift fall from grace and banishment here. Bashir's a touch shocked, but recovers and presses plain simple Garak again to let himself be helped, the only viable option right now being to turn off the brainial implant and ride out to the withdrawal. Perhaps the offer of help finally convinces him, or perhaps he just doesn't have the spoons left to fight anymore, but the result is him agreeing, and we turn off the device. Plain simple Garak is unconscious, though whether that's a result of turning off the brainial implant or imposed by Bashir is unknown. The vigil is interrupted by a visit from Odo, who wants to talk to plain simple Garak. There are some unsolved murders on his books, ones that he thinks were linked to the Obsidian Order, so developments here have raised some questions. He's destined for disappointment as Bashir tells him to bugger off. Until such time as plain simple Garak recovers, he's a patient before a suspect. A series of snapshots tells us that time has passed, though not how much. Bashir wakes from an armchair nap to find plain simple Garak awake and weeping. That turns to anger when Bashir tries to help, and he goes on a destructive rampage through his own apartment while ranting about having wasted 2 years. We also get more backstory, though it would be more accurate to say a different one. Plain simple Garak now claims he was favoured by Enabran Tain, essentially the apprentice of the most powerful man on Cardassia. A bright future was thrown away not by killing those escapees and some civilians along with them, but by being the person who freed them. In the new story, he and his mate Elim were interrogating them when plain simple Garak was struck by how utterly pointless it all was. They were just children who lived in ruins, and all he wanted was to be done with it, so he let them go, all while watched by an aghast Elim. Bashir likes this story far more, which only angers plain simple Garak further. He says he was a fool who threw everything away, and for 2 long years now. The only faint glimmer of positivity in his life has been a weekly lunch of replicated slop with a smug twat. The anger boils over into violence and he flies at Bashir. It ends only when he has a seizure of some sort and Bashir calls another emergency. We're back in the infirmary, and plain simple Garak is having a bad time of things. Bashir doesn't understand why. The brainial implant is still off, so that's not the cause, but something is buggering up his immune system. We do a science to fill half a minute and discover his white blood cells have been tinkered with. We can make new ones apparently, but that would take longer than he's got left, based on Bashir's estimate. As this started happening after the brainial implant was turned off, the logical choice seems to be turning it back on. Plain simple Garak is awake to hear that suggestion though, and expressly forbids it. He thanks Bashir for trying, and treats him to another version of his story as a reward, and this one's the truth. Honest. In the latest tale, he and his mate Elim were both the favoured of Enabran Tain, and widely feared by all. That is, until rumour of some deliberately freed prisoners started circulating, with plain simple Garak's name being whispered in connection with it. Tain was retired to a colony by this point and couldn't defend him, so he did what any member of the Obsidian Order would do, and tried to frame Elim. The problem with his plan is that Elim was also a member of the Obsidian Order and had got his knife in first. Cue him being exiled as before, but this time saying he deserved it for his attempted betrayal. Bashir doesn't understand why this is so important that it needs to be said now, so plain simple Garak is blunt. He wants absolution. Whether it's for the story he's telling now is another matter entirely, but Bashir provides it anyway. He's not quite so ready to give up as his patient, though. That's why he's going to see Enabran Tain in his retirement colony. It would seem that at least this part of the tale was true, and Bashir manages to track him down. Teleporting straight into the home of a former spy master is pretty ballsy, but turns out fine, as Enabran Tain knew he was coming. He's fully aware of who Bashir is, right down to his preference of hot beverage, and moves on to asking how plain simple Garak is doing. He says he's surprised by Bashir wanting to save his life. If he knew plain simple Garak at all, he'd understand just how unbearable exile must be for him. And that, Tain says, after hearing what Bashir needs, is exactly why he's willing to help. Whatever plain simple Garak actually did, it was sufficient to make Tain want him to suffer for as long as possible. He'll provide Bashir with medical data to make sure that happens. Before he goes, Bashir can't resist a question. He asks about the friend plain simple Garak mentioned throughout all his stories, the man called Elim. Tain laughs and grudgingly compliments plain simple Garak's instinctual use of lies, or to use his full name, plain simple Elim Garak. Bashir is sitting at a table and poking his food. He's unexpectedly joined by plain simple Garak, who says he's had enough of resting and feels fine now. Being out of bed also means Odo's had a go at him, but it's simple enough to deny this damnably silly rumour that he was ever a member of the Obsidian Order, so that's the end of that. He's also brought another Cardigan book for Bashir to try, one he thinks will be better received. Perhaps prompted by the topic of fiction, Bashir asks which of his stories were true. All of them, he's told, so we'll leave Bashir to contemplate quite what that means, until the next adventure. A Taylor and Twink episode then, and a banger to boot. We're fleshing out Bashir and plain simple Garak's friendship, and having it properly recognised as such. We've had them together previously, but that was presented more as two lads go on an adventure than anything else, so the clarification is welcome. That the story is an allegory for substance abuse will likely not have escaped anybody's attention here, so I'll add only that I'm glad the show gave him strong reasons for wanting the escape rather than painting him, and people with addictions in general by extension, as someone who's simply weak. To the meat of it then, and we learn a few things in this one. It's the first mention of the Obsidian Order, for example, introducing a new piece into the Cardigan political game. It's not yet fleshed out enough to explain how that interacts with military and civilian powers, but it offers plenty of fun options in the future. We also finally confirm that plain simple Garak is indeed both a spy and an exile, that is, unless this whole thing is a very long con indeed. His own stories on the topic may be of questionable accuracy, but the introduction of Enabran Tain essentially serves as proof to parts. And what of those stories then? What can we sift and learn about him? The first is of him ordering the destruction of a civilian transport with escaped Bajorans on board. The second is of him being the one who initially freed those same Bajorans. The third details the repercussions of rumours about someone freeing Bajoran prisoners. The first one then. Clearly Elim wasn't killed by a shuttle kabooming, but what about the rest? Was he responsible for the deaths of civilians to achieve a goal? Well, it's certainly possible if he felt as untouchable as he describes in the later stories. Perhaps then the death of Elim that he mentions is a psychological one, a reference to the destruction of either his morals or career. As to the second story, it could be equally true in parts. Perhaps it happened as he described, and that precipitated his downfall. Or perhaps he was the Elim in the story, watching someone else, maybe the friend he mentions, freeing the prisoners and being shocked. And that could tie into the third, too, framed by his friend for the actions he witnessed. Or vice versa, and he was the one who did both the freeing and the framing. That doesn't tie in with him also being exiled, but perhaps the people who feared them thought it was a good chance to get rid of them both. Or maybe the favoured of Enabran Tain were getting in the way of another Obsidian Order operative's ambitions. Enemies of both would claim it could have been either, best to exile the pair of them and start over. Bashir nods to these stories all being fabrications when he provides absolution, "I forgive you for whatever it is that you did." But hiding the truth in lies is something we've suspected plain simple Garak of doing before, isn't it? The joke about being an exiled spy slotted flippantly into conversation so that it would be discounted. Maybe that's the case here, maybe it isn't. Maybe what matters more is that he asked for absolution at all. That, I think, is the most important part. We learn that he's afflicted by overwhelming remorse. He doesn't feel that he was unfairly treated, he genuinely believes that he deserved his punishment. For what, we can't be certain, but using the logic of hiding truth in lies again, it's related to his service on Bajor. Let's give Bashir some attention, shall we? He finally admits that plain simple Garak is more than a mere curiosity to him, something he's manoeuvred into during the conversation with Dax. Sufficiently more, in fact, that he's willing to put himself in significant personal danger. The Obsidian Order disappears people for eating the wrong lunch, and he breaks into the former head's home. Why? Because he's Bashir. We're back onto the favoured topics of the channel, neurodivergence and found family. Bashir doesn't have many people he'd call friend because of how he is. If you're of the spicy brain persuasion, there's a fair chance you understand how strong the resulting bonds can be. Bashir does all of this because plain simple Garak, on some level, meshes perfectly with how Bashir's brain works. The randomness that isn't random once you understand the logic, to be the outsider as a result, to struggle with others because their heads work in a fundamentally different way. Come to think of it, that last point is a good argument for why he's so drawn to Dax, too. Let's finish up with one of those nice little touches I like to point out now and again. When Sisko's in the infirmary for his contractually mandated appearance in the episode, he's told to try and avoid yelling at more admirals. While I suspect it's entirely unintentional, it does tie in nicely with the recent Marquis unpleasantness. Perhaps he's been trying to make them take the situation seriously, perhaps he's been defending Hudson, perhaps he just wanted someone to yell at and thought anybody up the chain was more deserving than the people around him. What it shows, though, is an important lesson: the benefits of developing a character. Sisko wasn't merely a passenger during the events of the Marquis two-parter, he showed how it affected him and what he thought of the whole situation. As a direct result of that, we can make a connection here that may or may not even exist. When you give your characters agency of their own, sometimes they will fill in the blanks themselves. End of episode.
Space Dog, I've got us a job.
One that pays actual money?
Yup.
And it's not from Morn?
Nope.
Alright, I'm listening.
We've been hired to help make a travel guide. Deep Space Nine is a hub of commerce and exploration, but so many people who come here don't know what to expect or how it works.
Sounds like an actually useful thing. No wonder Starfleet didn't think of it till now.
Oh, we're not being employed by Starfleet or the Bajorans. In fact, we're not even making the brochure. All we have to do is gather as much data as we can about how the station works, and send it back to our employer.
That's even easier. Who are they?
A little book company called Dominion Publishing.
Brilliant. Everybody's going to be so pleased when they find out how much we've helped them. Woof.